The first time he saw her was in a dream so quiet that it almost felt like nothing had happened. He was walking through a corridor that had no end, the walls gray and trembling like mist. His footsteps echoed even though the ground beneath him was soft, almost like velvet. He could not remember how he entered that place, nor why he was there, but he knew he was searching. The air was thick, and every sound seemed muffled, as though the world was holding its breath. And then, through that silence, she appeared, a figure at the far end of the corridor, standing perfectly still, waiting. She did not move, but he felt her eyes on him. He could not describe her face at first. It was blurred, like smoke refusing to form a shape. Yet there was something undeniable in her presence, something that pulled at him. His chest tightened with recognition, though he knew he had never seen her before. She turned slowly, her hair brushing against the dim light, and walked into a door that opened soundlessly before her. He ran after her, but as soon as he reached the door, the dream broke apart like glass. He woke with start, drenched in sweat. The room around him was quiet, his ceiling fan clicking lazily as it turned. He pressed his palms against his face, breathing heavily. He tried to recall her features, but they slipped from his mind the way water slips from clenched fists. Still, the feeling remained, a kind of hunger, a strange unrest that left him staring at the ceiling long after the night had passed. The second night she returned. This time she was closer. He found himself standing in a deserted train station, the tracks stretching into darkness. The lamps overhead flickered, their yellow glow stuttering like a dying heartbeat. And there she was, sitting on a bench, her legs crossed delicately, her posture too calm for the emptiness of the place. He could almost see her face this time, dark eyes that held both sadness and invitation, lips parted as if she were about to whisper his name. He froze, afraid that if he moved, she would vanish. She lifted her gaze slowly, and the corners of her mouth curled into the faintest smile. He felt an ache deep in his chest, the kind of ache that came from wanting something you could not name. He stepped toward her, but the train arrived without warning, roaring through the station with a wind so fierce it nearly threw him back. When the train was gone, so was she. The bench sat empty and the silence returned. He awoke gasping, his hands trembling against the sheets. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as though he had been running for miles. The dream felt too real, sharper than memory. He lay in bed until dawn, his body restless with a longing he did not understand. By the third night, he was already waiting for her. He went to sleep earlier than usual, his mind secretly anticipating her return. And she did not disappoint. This time, she stood in a garden filled with white flowers that glowed faintly in the moonlight. She was dressed in something pale, the fabric moving with the breeze, though the air felt perfectly still around him. Her eyes caught his, and she extended a hand as if inviting him closer. He wanted to resist, to ask who she was, what she wanted, but his body betrayed him. He walked toward her, each step heavy with desire. The closer he came, the stronger the air seemed to hum, and when he finally stood before her, he could see her face clearly. She was breathtaking, but not in the way beauty is usually described. Her beauty was haunting, dangerous, like a flame you know will burn you, yet still you cannot look away. Her eyes seemed older than her face, carrying stories that pressed into his mind without words. She whispered something then, so softly he couldn't understand, but her lips brushed the air as though the sound was meant only for him. He tried to touch her hand, but as soon as his fingers grazed hers, the dream dissolved. He woke with his heart hammering, his mouth dry, and a sharp ache spreading through him as though the dream had followed him back into waking life. He could not escape her. Each day, she lingered in his mind like perfume clinging to the skin. He thought of her while drinking his morning coffee, while staring out the window at work, while lying awake at night. He told himself it was just a dream, nothing more. But deep inside, he knew dreams were not supposed to feel like this. The nights became his secret. He no longer dreaded sleep. He craved it. Each evening, he moved through the hours with restless anticipation, counting the minutes until he could lie down and close his eyes. The world of daylight began to feel dull, drained of color. His colleagues spoke to him at work, but he hardly heard them. The streets looked lifeless, the air stale. Only when night came did he feel alive, because only then did she return. On the fourth night, he found himself in a dimly lit room that smelled faintly of smoke and old wood. A single candle burned on a table, its flame wavering in the shadows. She stood beside it, waiting, her eyes locked on his as though she had been expecting him all along. This time she spoke, her voice a low whisper, so soft it melted into the silence. He couldn't remember the words when he woke, but he remembered the way her voice curved around him, how it made his skin tighten and his breath falter. It was not what she said that mattered. It was the way she made him feel, like a moth circling a flame it could not resist. He tried, once, to tell himself that he was going mad. Perhaps stress had cracked his mind. Perhaps loneliness had found a cruel way to taunt him. But whenever he thought of her face, that explanation felt weak, hollow. She was too real, too precise, each detail etched into him more clearly than waking memories. He remembered the way her hair had fallen across her cheek, the slight hesitation in her smile, the shadow of something unreadable in her eyes. These were not the fragments of imagination. These were impressions left behind by someone who existed. By the fifth night, she touched him, not a full embrace, not even a graze of lips against lips, but her hand on his cheek, fingers trembling slightly as though she too was afraid of breaking the fragile fabric of their connection. He felt the warmth of her skin, the softness of her touch, and it lingered long after he awoke. He pressed his own palm against his cheek in the morning, desperate to find even a trace of the sensation, but his skin was cold, empty. Desire began to consume him, not just desire for her body, though that hunger grew each night, sharpening with unbearable intensity. It was more than that. He desired her presence, the way she seemed to fill every corner of his mind, the way the world of dreams felt more alive with her in it than the world of day ever had. He started to skip meals. His friends stopped calling after he ignored them too many times. Even his reflection in the mirror became foreign to him. Eyes darker, jaw sharper, an expression he did not recognize. On the sixth night, she kissed him. It was gentle at first, her lips pressing against his as though testing the limits of what was allowed. But then the kiss deepened, pulling him into her with a force that made his knees weak. His whole body trembled as he surrendered to her, a surrender that felt both inevitable and terrifying. The kiss burned into him, left him gasping when he awoke, his chest heaving, his sheets tangled around him like restraints. His body ached with need, his mind with obsession. He could no longer separate dream from reality. Walking down the street, he thought he saw a reflection in shop windows, her figure disappearing into crowds. At night, the boundaries dissolved completely. He began to fear that one day he would not wake at all, that he would remain with her forever. Strangely, that thought did not frighten him as much as it should have. It tempted him. By the seventh night, she spoke again, clearer this time. She whispered his name. It startled him, because he had never spoken it to her. He stumbled back, heart pounding, but her gaze pinned him where he stood. She said again, softer, with a longing that made his chest ache. Then she told him something else. Words had slipped away the moment he opened his eyes, but he remembered the sensation they carried, a promise and a warning. Each night grew heavier, like a thread pulling him deeper into a place for which there might be no return. He stopped questioning her existence. He no longer wondered why she came or what she wanted. He only knew he could not live without her. Sleep had become his addiction. He no longer cared about work, about bills piling up on his desk, about the unanswered calls from his family. All that mattered was the night, the moment his eyes would close and her world would open for him again. He ate little, spoke less, and drifted through his days like a ghost. Yet when darkness came, he came alive, stepping into a realm where every breath carried her presence and every shadow bent toward her. On the eighth night, he found himself in a grand hall, its ceilings lost in darkness, its floor polished like a mirror. Columns rose on either side, stretching endlessly into nothingness. At the far end, she stood waiting, her dress flowing as though the air itself clung to her. He moved toward her, but with each step the hall stretched longer, the distance refusing to close. Desperation seized him, and he began to run, his footsteps echoing like thunder. Then suddenly, without a sound, she was there before him, her hand against his chest, steadying him. He collapsed against her, his breath ragged, and for the first time he heard her laugh, a sound soft and low, yet heavy with something he could not name. Her laugh haunted him more than her silence ever had. It followed him back into waking life, curling around his thoughts until he could no longer hear his own. He remembered its rhythm, its softness, and the way it seemed to carry a shadow beneath the sweetness, as though it belonged to someone who knew more about him than he knew about himself. On the ninth night, her words came back. She spoke his name again, but this time it was sharper, urgent. She pulled him close, her lips grazing his ear, her breath warm against his skin. He felt the pull of her body, the unmistakable weight of desire pressing into him. His hands trembled as he reached for her, terrified she would vanish, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned into him, her voice wrapping around him like a spell. He could not recall the words when he woke, but he knew she had told him something important, something that made his body ache with longing and his heart with fear. He started to wonder if he was still dreaming when awake. His apartment felt hollow, the furniture meaningless, the walls pressing in on him. He would catch his reflection in the window at night and swear he saw her standing behind him, her eyes meeting his through the glass. He stopped inviting people over, because he feared they would see what he saw, hear the whispers he heard in the corners of silence. On the 10th night, she led him through a forest. The trees bent over them, their branches twisting like fingers reaching down. She walked ahead, barefoot, her steps silent on the mossy ground. He followed without question, his eyes fixed on the sway of her hair, the curve of her shoulders. The forest grew darker, but he did not care. He would have followed her anywhere. At last, she stopped in a clearing bathed in moonlight. She turned to him, her expression unreadable, and placed her hand on his chest. His heartbeat thundered against her palm. She leaned in, her lips so close he could taste the air she exhaled, and whispered, "You are mine." The words seared into him like fire. He jolted awake, clutching his chest, the echo of her voice vibrating in his bones. He sat in the darkness of his room, trembling, the words replaying in his mind until dawn broke. "You are mine." The next day, he could not function. Every sound was muffled, every sight dim. He walked through crowds but felt utterly alone. Yet inside, a strange certainty began to grow. He belonged to her. Whether she was a dream, a spirit, or a figment of madness no longer mattered. She had claimed him, and he wanted nothing else. By the 11th night, he no longer resisted. He let himself fall into the dream completely, surrendering every thought, every fear, every shred of logic he once held. When he saw her, he did not hesitate. He rushed into her arms, and she welcomed him, her embrace both tender and suffocating. Her lips burned against his skin, her fingers tracing lines that set fire to his body. The hunger between them swelled until it consumed him, pulling him deeper than ever before. When he awoke, he wept, not from fear, not from sorrow, but from the emptiness of her absence. His chest ached, his skin cold, his bed too vast without her beside him. He knew then that waking life was illusion. The dreams were the truth. The dreams were where he belonged. She began to feel less like a visitor and more like the axis around which his nights turned. Each dream folded into the next, braided with memory and desire until he could no longer tell where one ended and another began. Days blurred. His apartment became a holding cell between two worlds. He would wake, count the hours until darkness, and then surrender himself again to her. Friends tried to pull him back, calls, messages, concerned voices, but he let them fade like distant thunder. He had stopped explaining. How could he explain that the only real thing in his life stood at the edge of sleep and held the shape of a promise? On the 12th night, the dream world was colder. The air had an edge as if winter had come early, and his breath formed clouds when he moved. He found himself standing at the shore of a black sea where the waves licked the sand without sound. Moonlight was thin and brittle as glass. She waited on the water's edge, her dress dark now, clinging to her as though it had been dipped. When she turned, there was something like urgency in her eyes. No sadness now, only a hard, luminous focus that made him feel seen in a way that hurt. She crossed the sand toward him, and the world narrowed to the space between them. Her fingers brushed his hand, light as the flicker of a candle. "You have come far," she said, and her voice rolled like distant thunder softened by the sea. "You have given everything." He wanted to say he would give more, that he would give his life, his name, his memory, anything to be with her. Instead, he only watched, because language felt brittle. She took his face in both hands, and for a heartbeat he thought the boundary might break and she would stay. Then she stepped back and placed something in his palm, a small, smooth stone warmed as if by the sun. It pulsed faintly, a heartbeat against the skin. "Remember," she whispered, and the echo of that single word spread through him like a tide. "Remember who you were before me." The words were not a plea but a command, and they carried a weight he had not expected. He opened his mouth to ask what she meant, but the sea swallowed the sound, turning it into wind. He woke before the dawn, the stones warm still like a phantom against his hand, though his palm was empty. For the first time since the dreams began, a crack of doubt opened in him. Who had he been before her? He had no memory that felt complete. He could sketch the edges of his past, his apartment, the job he drifted through, solitude like a well, but the interior, the self he might have been, felt eroded, indistinct. The stone's command, "remember," stayed with him like a whisper at the nape of his neck, insistently present. That day he found himself wandering through parts of the city he'd avoided for years. He drifted into an old bookstore because it smelled right, of dust and glue and the thin ache of pages. The owner, an elderly man with hands like folded maps, watched him with a curiosity that felt tender. He did not look like someone who would ask questions, but he did. "You seem like you're searching." The man's voice seemed to carry a familiarity he didn't expect. "Maybe you are looking for more than a book." He laughed without humor. "Maybe," he said. He bought a volume at random, an old collection of myths with a cracked spine, and left with it tucked under his arm like a talisman. The city outside was washed in a late winter light that made everything look fragile. He turned a corner and nearly collided with a woman leaving a cafe. She was ordinary in the way ordinary people can stab your attention. Brown coat, scarf askew, coffee in hand. For a sliver of a second, the world stilling, her features aligned to the woman of his nights. The same eyes, the same curve of cheek. His heart stuttered, and for a moment he imagined her smiling knowingly as if she recognized the truth. She did not. She hurried past, apologizing as people do when their lives are not engaged with yours. He watched her go, and the echo of disappointment was sharp and hollow. He had been foolish, he thought. Dreams did not come into cafes to spill spells. Or did they? The stone's whisper threaded through his mind again. "Remember who you were before me." That night, he did not rush into sleep. He sat with the book on his lap and a window open to December's thin air, and he let memory come like a slow tide. Faces surfaced, parents with outstretched hands, a childhood room where light pooled in the same place each afternoon, friends whose names flitted on the edges of recollection. He had been someone who read maps by the soles of his shoes, someone who liked the architecture of quiet places. He had been, he realized, a man who had chosen to contain himself, to ration feeling like a cup of tea. The thought made something ache in him. Perhaps loneliness had been the shape, ready to receive the woman dream had conjured. When sleep finally came, it felt less like surrender and more like stepping through a curtain. The dream opened on a room he had never seen, or perhaps had simply forgotten. Walls lined with frames, small photographs pinned at angles as if someone had been trying to make sense of life by looking very closely. In the center of the room she stood, her expression patient. He moved among the frames and his breath caught. The photographs were of him, not as he was now, but fragments of his past. A boy with a crooked bicycle, a young man laughing at a corner table, a tired face in a graduation cap. Each picture was a small incision into a life he had allowed to dim. He had been here, after all, before her. She watched him with the same soft something in her eyes. "You were never empty," she said, and for the first time kindness folded into her voice without the undertow of command. "You filled yourself in careful places. You forgot the rest." He tried to touch the photographs, to make them whole, but they were already whole in him. Memory flooded in like a river, finding a channel. Names, addresses, the precise smell of his mother's tea. It was as if a curtain had been lifted and a room lit that he had mistaken for shadow. She stepped closer and took his hand, no longer with hunger but with an almost gentle ferocity. "I did not make you," she said. "I found what you had set aside." The truth came slowly and not without grief. She had been the echo of things he had never allowed to surface, the presence that gathered the unsaid and gave it form. He felt both small and enormous at the same time. Small because he had let so much of himself idle. Enormous because there was a life inside him that had not been destroyed, only misplaced. When he woke, the ache was different. Not the severe, hollow ache of obsession, but tender, raw thing that hummed with possibility. He kept expecting her return that night with the old hunger and the promise, but the dream did not arrive in the shape he had known. It came instead as a memory of the woman at the shore and of the stone that had insisted, "Remember." In the morning he found, tucked beneath his pillow where no hand could have placed it, a small smooth stone with a warmth he could not explain. He turned in his palm and felt the ridges of a life that had been waiting. From then on, things shifted as if the axis of his world had been nudged. He still saw her in dreams, but she was less a captor and more a guide. She led him through rooms of his past he had sealed, and when he emerged he found himself smiling at the ordinary. A neighbor's cat sunning itself, a bookshop's quiet corner, a friend's clumsy attempt at humor. He began to answer calls, to eat, to walk without thinking of sleep as salvation. The hunger remained, but it was tempered by a growing tenderness for the man he rediscovered. And yet sometimes, on nights when the city exhaled and the moon was thin, he would stand at the window and look out at the dark and feel that under the ordinary, a current still ran. He did not know if she existed beyond the dreams, or whether she was forever a shape stitched from longing and memory. He did not need to know. He had been found, and, in being found, had remembered how to exist. He kept the stone on his windowsill where morning light could warm it. Sometimes he would press his palm to it and remember the woman at the shore and the command that had been a gift. He slept more deliberately now, not to flee but to visit, and when she came she no longer took. She showed. She taught him that desire could be a doorway rather than trap, that the edges of longing could be softened by attention to what was already there. The last dream did not end with a kiss or a claim. It ended with a hand lifted in farewell, not because she was leaving him, but because she had helped him return to himself. He woke with a taste of salt on his lips, the stone warm in his hand, and a quiet in the chest that felt like completion rather than absence. He dressed and went outside into the day, carrying with him the memory of nights that had taught him more about himself than any daylight ever had. The world was still slow. It had not become spectacular, but it was fuller, threaded now with the note of voice that had once called him together, and in calling had given him back his life.